I swear, at a certain point in this episode, and after this episode was over, all I could think of was one song. My anaconda don't want none unless you got buns, hun. So yeah, Lovecraft Country episode 2 entitled Whiteys on the Moon. And from here on out with my Lovecraft Country reviews, I'm just jumping straight into spoilers. I did review the first episode of Lovecraft Country. The first half of the video was a non-spoiler review and the second half of the video was a spoiler review. So if you haven't seen Lovecraft Country, I suggest you watch it and also check out my review. Link for that will pop up here. But yeah, I'm jumping straight into spoilers from here on out for this show. And so yeah, episode 2 of Lovecraft Country, it opens the next day after episode 1, and Letty, George, and Atticus are in the house of the Braithwaites. And this is a stylistic choice that Misha Green is doing, where she's taking elements throughout Black history and pop culture and using them to craft the story that takes place in 1950s, where in the first episode where she used a speech by James Baldwin, where I believe that speech was given in 1965. And then you have this episode where it opens up with the theme song for the Jeffersons, which the Jeffersons didn't come out until 1975, yet this show takes place in 1950s. Probably, I would say 1954, because it takes place after Atticus was coming home from the Korean War, and the Korean War, I think, ended in 1953, so maybe like a year later. But anyway, so the show opens up with the theme song for the Jeffersons, and Letty and Uncle George are living their best life, where you see Uncle George, where he's in this room surrounded by a library of books, and he's just, again, he's living his best life. Whereas Letty, she's in a room with a full entire wardrobe of fashionable designer clothes, and you just see a montage of her trying on different outfits, and they're just having a good old time as if they weren't just attacked by Shoggoth monsters the night before. And it's a very almost comedic way to open this particular episode, as a way to kind of disarm you and also put you in the mindset of both Letty and George and make you go, something strange is happening, because they are way too happy right now. And then eventually moves to Atticus, and you see he's not having any of it. And unlike the other two, he's still stressed out about the attack from the Shoggoth monsters from the night before. And he also, in a way, feels imprisoned in this mansion-like house, and he doesn't trust anything that's happening right now. And when our three characters get back together, you're introduced to another character named William. And at the moment the camera panned to that actor, Jordan Patrick Smith, and the moment he started delivering his lines and just in the mannerisms that he was acting, I was just like, this guy reminds me of someone. And then it finally hit me, and he reminds me of a young Eric Northman from True Blood, played by Alexander Skarsgård. And for those of you that aren't fans of True Blood, you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but just go Google scenes from Eric Northman. And for those of you that are fans of True Blood, am I crazy? He strikes me as an imitation of Eric Northman. Everything about him, from his hair to his mannerisms to how he looks. And I'm like, I don't know if that was done on purpose or what, but I'm like, this guy is Eric Northman. And now granted, I don't trust his ass one bit, but at the same time, I'm still like, Jordan Patrick Smith, hey, I love me a vampire, even though he's not really playing a vampire, but I'm still just like, bow chicka wow wow. But anyway, he begins to escort our three protagonists to the terrace so they can enjoy lunch. And while walking them out, he begins to tell them a story about the origins of the Braithwaite family. And I'll get to that a little bit later, because that also comes into importance later on in the story. But once they get outside, and actually, let me say this about this particular episode really quick. In many ways, you really have to pay attention while watching this episode, because there's so much information that they give you and just so much going on in this second episode. For me in particular, I found myself a little confused watching it the first time around, and I had to watch it another time, and after watching it the second time, I got it. But I felt like the first episode was kind of like a first date, where you're getting to know the person, you're slowly getting a reveal into their world and whether you want to perhaps go on a second date with that person, and you're basically determined whether you like that person or not. And episode 2 for me was like, you suddenly wake up and you're in a 5-year relationship with this person, but yet you don't remember the last 5 years. And I'll go more into detail what I mean by that a little bit later. But yeah, when our three protagonists are alone on the terrace, it's revealed that Uncle George and Letty have absolutely no recollection of the Shoggoth monster attack that happened the night before, which explains their carefree attitude about being in this manner. And Letty also says a line that made me laugh out loud, going, I know that's right. When she requested some salt and pepper from the butler, and she was like, because you know white people don't season their food. And I just couldn't help but laugh out loud. And I was like, that's the gospel truth. But yeah, so as Letty, Uncle George, and Atticus, Tick for short, are talking about the attack from last night, at first I was like, are they pretending to not remember what happened? Because there's a moment where Uncle George says to them, like, be quiet, we're being watched. So I was like, oh, is he just playing dumb because he realized they're being watched and he's waiting until they're actually alone? But then you find out throughout the next scene that no, they really don't remember what's happening. And in a lot of ways, I was like, it's an interesting allegory to what white supremacy ends up doing to people, where white supremacy is so pervasive in basically all facets of life that sometimes it'll have you doubting your own experiences, and sometimes your own people will end up gaslighting you, which is what Letty and Uncle George do when they start questioning whether Atticus is actually sane or perhaps going through some type of shell shock from his time in the war. And that's further compounded by the fact that the car that Letty drove into the cabin in the woods is now miraculously fixed somehow. And it goes to show you, just like white supremacy, the Braithwaites actually have the power to alter a person's own perceptions. And it's like, imagine if they actually took that power and used it for good. And again, that's something I'll get to a little later when we talk about the meaning of the title of this episode, Whiteys on the Moon. And there's another moment, just like in episode 1, where I was like, thank you, Misha Green, and the black people behind the scenes writing this show, showing why black people just do better in horror situations. Because there is a moment that Tick says to Uncle George and Letty that he wants to go off on his own to explore this land, to go off to the inner village and basically go and look for his father. So he says we should split up. And Letty and Uncle George are basically like, hell no, are you crazy? We're not splitting up. We're in this place with all these white people. A, we don't trust these white people. And B, these white people are treating us really nice. There's something nefarious going on. So we're not splitting up. And I was like, see? Bravo. Like, black people, we're not splitting up in any type of situation like this, because you don't know how many times I watch horror movies with mostly white people, and for no reason at all, they all say, let's split up and we can cover more ground. And it's like, that's how you die. That's why you die. And I'm like, see, making decisions like that is what happens when you don't have natural predators in life, because you just don't think. But see, black people, we come into this world knowing there's certain things we can't do, certain things we can't say, certain spaces we're not allowed in. And so we just think a certain way. So it's like, you go into a certain environment, you're like, hell no, we're not splitting up. Are you crazy? And I was just like, thank you, Misha Green. But yeah, but because of all the strangeness and stuff that's happening at the Braithwaite Manor, like, Tick starts to get aggressive, and he takes out his aggression on this woman who I believe is the sheriff of this town, and as she's holding 2 German Shepherd dogs. And I'm just like, Tick, if you don't calm your ass down, like, these white people already don't like you. Like, you don't want to come across as the angry black man. But at the same time, I was like, him being aggressive like that's kind of sexy. I was like, ooh, Tick, baby, defend me, baby. Ha! And so this woman, she ends up saying some real racist shit, basically comparing black people to beasts. And I was just like, ooh, I want her to die. And I don't just want her to die, I want her to die bloody. And they eventually come to the conclusion that there's only one stone building in this entire village, and that's where they're keeping Montrose, who's Tick's father. And so they decide to come back later, and while walking back to the manor, Uncle George suddenly has this recollection of a story that Tick's mother told him years ago, where she basically divulged information about her great ancestor, who was a slave named Hannah. She escaped a fire from her slave master's house, and they're able to put 2 and 2 together from the story that William told them earlier in the episode of how Titus Braithwaite, who's more or less the great patriarch of this family, how he is notoriously nice to his slaves. Basically coming to the conclusion, the connection between Titus Braithwaite and Tick is that Hannah was basically raped by Titus Braithwaite. And so Tick is also a descendant of Titus Braithwaite, which also kind of makes sense to why he's immune to the magic, of why he's able to remember the attack from the previous night. And speaking of attack, they are attacked once again by the Shoggoth monster. monsters. And once again, they're saved by Christina Braithwaite. And this time you see in real time how Letty and George instantly forget that they were just attacked. They looking around, they're like, why are we covered in dirt? And it kind of reminded me of something that happened in season 5 of Buffy. Again, if you're not a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you're not going to understand this reference, but just go with me. And for those of you that are fans, hopefully you remember this, but it reminds me of the spell that would happen when anybody would see Glorificus transform into her human form and they would instantly forget that Glory and Ben are one and the same. That's what that reminded me of in this episode. But I also know Joss Whedon is heavily influenced by H.P. Lovecraft as well, with his inclusion of like the old ones in his properties, and he had a Cthulhu-like monster and the Hellmouth monster. But yeah, like I said, if you've never watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer before, you won't understand what I'm saying, and I feel sorry for your life. Nah, I'm just kidding, but no. Really. I will say though, the moment where the Shoggoth monsters appeared to attack Letty in the woods, the CGI for that didn't look as good as the first episode. Like that opening scene where Tick is having that dream and you see the Cthulhu monsters and all that stuff, and then also later on in the first episode where you see the Shoggoth monsters attack, that looked great in the first episode, but this time I was like, it doesn't look as good. Granted, it didn't look terrible, but I was like, this looks kind of fake. But it's just a minor gripe that I had when that scene happened. But anyway, so the next scene, you see Tick bargaining with Christina, asking her to remove the spell from Letty and George. And going back to what I said earlier about this episode feeling like you waking up in a 5-year relationship but not remembering the last 5 years, part of me was like, did I miss something? Because during this whole scene, you have Tick talking to Christina about magic and spells, and then you see this invisible force field that's trapping him in this room. At no point did Tick seem like he was freaking out at this idea of magic being real. Like, never did he ask, like, how is this possible? How are you doing this? How is magic like this has to be some type of trick. Magic isn't real. He just seemed to embrace the whole idea and have this conversation as if he's had it a million times before, and how he's been in this world for years, even though, based on what we know, he only just found out about this last night. And it's almost kind of the same with Uncle George and Letty, where in the next scene, once they get their memories back, they are visited by illusions that represent their fears, desires. It kind of basically just revealed that they all have secrets from one another. Uncle George is visited by an illusion of Tick's mother, and you see them getting real close and real romantic with each other. And jumping forward, it's revealed Uncle George might be more than Uncle George. Uncle George might be Daddy George, where him and his brother Montrose have a conversation that they don't know whose kid Tick belongs to. Like, Tick could be George's kid. And I'm just like, ooh, escandalo, Daddy George. And in that scene, like, you find out that he knows that she's not real, but he's still going with it. And he's not really freaking out that this type of magic is happening. And also during that scene, he mentions a book, which is an Easter egg that I had to look up after the show was over, called The House on the Borderland, which I believe came out in 1908. And this basically, the significance of that book is it's one of the books that inspired H.P. Lovecraft. But yeah, speaking of romance, Letty is visited by an illusion of Tick, and talking about secrets, you get a reveal of a little bit of why Letty decided to skip her mother's funeral, in that her mother basically abandoned her when she was a kid and left her to pretty much fend for herself. And also during that scene, you see Letty and Tick getting a little frisky, and it was in this scene that basically got the song in my head from the intro, where there's a picture on the wall of Adam and Eve, and while Adam and Eve are about to have sex, you see Adam's penis is in the form of a snake. And so when Tick is unbuttoning his pants, his penis is an actual snake. And from that moment on, that song was in my head. And then you jump to the next scene where you see Tick is visited by that same alien-looking girl that he was dreaming about in that very first scene. Except this time she isn't a red alien, she's just a regular woman. And I'm assuming this is the same woman that he called in Korea in the first episode. And she's attacking him in what I believe probably is a moment that we're gonna get revealed later on that happened during the Korean War. While I was watching this entire episode, I had the caption on, and so while she was screaming, the caption said, screaming in the language of Adam. And so I was like, so it didn't surprise me later on when you get introduced to Samuel Braithwaite's character, and he starts talking about God and the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. I had a feeling like that something was going to play into the storyline when the caption said the language of Adam, because that's very specific. And I read enough fantasy fiction books with angels and Nephilim and all that to know exactly what that meant. I mean, hell, like you can see right there on the shelf, I got the Fallen books 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that's a whole series about a half Nephilim, half human. So yeah, but yeah, speaking more about Samuel Braithwaite, I was like, oh, look at that, it's President Fitz from Scale. I didn't know Tony Goldwyn was in this show. And when you first are introduced to him, you think he's being tortured for some reason, but it turns out he purposely was subjecting himself to that level of pain to literally have his liver removed so he could feed it to the cult Order of the Dawn. And I was just like, what kind of sick, twisted bullshit are these people engaged in? And despite having his whole liver removed, he's still alive and kicking, and his wound ends up healing himself because, you know, magic. But I'm just like, sir, you should be dead. But anyway, jumping forward, you see that Tick, Uncle George, or Daddy George, and Letty ends up finding Tick's father or uncle, Montrose. Either way, they get in the car and they try to haul ass out of that town and back home to Chicago. The car that they were driving ends up slamming into this magical, invisible barrier. And once again, just like the CGI from the monsters, I was like, the CGI from the car crash, I was like, that doesn't look that good. You see Samuel and Christina Braithwaite pull up in the car behind them, and Samuel's basically threatening Tick, like, you need to stay. And in order to get you to stay, he basically shot Letty in the stomach and Uncle George, and he healed Letty, but he was like, I won't heal George until you do what I want you to do. And that's basically to use his essence as an heir of Titus Braithwaite so that Samuel could open a door or a gateway to the Garden of Eden, and so he can achieve immortality. So getting him ready for this ritual ceremony, potential sacrifice, there's my favorite scene of this whole entire episode where you see some Jonathan Majors booty, and I was just like, those are some cakes. Goddamn. And truth of the matter is, even from the first episode, I was like, Jonathan Majors, like, he is sexy, and that boy, like, his lips, like, do you see his lips? Like, ooh, I would love to suck on those lips. But yeah, Atticus definitely has a butticus. But anyway, so then you get to the climax of the episode where Samuel Braithwaite is using a combination of what looks like alchemy and magic to open this portal to the Garden of Eden. And while this scene is happening, you hear a poem from a well-renowned black spoken word artist who is most famous for the song The Revolution Will Not Be Televised from the 70s, Gil Scott-Heron. And just like in the way James Baldwin's speech was playing during the first episode, you hear another famous poem that he gave in the 70s called Whiteys on the Moon, as Samuel Braithwaite is performing this spell to open up the Garden of Eden. And for those of you that don't know, and this is also something I had to look up, Whiteys on the Moon is basically about how the government is spending billions and billions of dollars investing in the space race, but yet never gave reparations to black people, never invested in poor black and brown communities to build them up, how bills continue to go up, how medical expenses continue to rise, but yet Whitey's on the moon. And it's just basically how a white government will exploit black and brown folk and are fine with black and brown suffering, but will spend billions and billions of dollars on one thing, but then when it comes to actually helping people, they'll say, well, where do you get the money from? And it's something that we still deal with today when it comes to, like, we can write blank checks for war, when it comes to building our infrastructure and giving housing for all, Medicare for all, forgiving student loan debt, free college for everyone. It's like, where are you going to get the money? But yet, Whitey's on the moon. And that's essentially what Samuel Braithwaite is doing to Tick. He's exploiting him and causing him to suffer for his desired goal to achieve immortality and inflate his ego of white superiority of some kind, because somehow he probably believes that he's a descendant of Adam, even though scientifically speaking the earliest known human is a black woman in Africa who they call mitochondrial Eve. So it's like, if anything, if Adam and Eve are real, they're black, which also means God made himself appear as black, because what did he say? He made Adam and Eve in his image. But anyway, just as the poem is ending, Tick gets a vision of what we now know as his great ancestor, Hannah, and she appears to be pregnant with a book in her hand. And using the power of the ancestors, she helps him escape this situation, and she causes the whole house to explode on itself, and Samuel turns into stone, and she ends up helping to lead him out and deliver him from this evil and get him out of this house, as you see a flashback of her running to escape the fire at the same time that Tick is running to escape the collapsing house. And it's like, see, black people, we should always trust and go back to trusting in the ancestors. We need to go back and embracing our original original religion and practicing root work and going back to conjure, because at the end of the day, the ancestors will not steer you wrong. But I'm pretty sure that book that Hannah was holding in her hand is going to play into some heavy significance later on in the show. I'm pretty sure maybe that's like a book of spells. It's that Necronomicon. It could be that Necronomicon or the Book of Life that they mentioned earlier in this episode. But yeah, but once Tick escapes, you hear the sad music playing, and I'm just like, oh no, I already know what this is. And you find out that Uncle or Daddy George is now dead, and I'm just like, no, not Uncle George. I'm like, how do you get Courtney B. Vance on this show for only 2 episodes and then kill him off? I'm like, nah, this isn't real life. Like, more than likely, I don't know how it's gonna play out, but I'm like, more than likely he's not gonna be dead. Either he's gonna come back as a ghost or some type of apparition or spirit or vision, or they're gonna figure out a way to bring him back. But yeah, I don't know. Or he could be completely dead and not come back for the rest of the run of the show. But yeah, but with everything going on in this particular episode, this episode to me felt more like a season finale than an episode 2. But either way, I'm here for it. I enjoyed this episode. And aside from the minor gripes that I had regarding the CGI, I still give this show a blockbuster. And based on the previews for the next week's episode, I'm excited to see the other characters that we were introduced to in episode 1 are seemingly going to play a major role in the show going forward. But yeah, so I'm both excited and curious to see where this show goes, especially considering the destruction of the Braithwaite family, which I'm pretty sure is going to come back sometime later. Like, they're not done with this Braithwaite storyline by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, the question is, what did you guys think of episode 2 of Lovecraft Country, Whiteys on the Moon? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you like it? Did you like this episode just as much as episode 1? Did you like episode 1 more? Did you like this episode more? Let me know down in the comment section below. Also, if you can't hit that thumbs up button and like this video to really help out the channel, and if this is your first time watching one of my videos, please check out the other videos on my channel. And if you like what you see, please subscribe for more and hit that bell notification button so you're alerted every single time I post a new video. And tell your friends, families, and neighbors about my channel to help me continue to grow. And as always, I'll catch you guys next time.